Hey everyone, it's Bob with another FINOP Controller webcast. This is part 2 on using allocations to automate the reserve calculation process. In this presentation, we're going to demonstrate how to sequence the allocation program to replicate a manually performed reserve calculation. The customer reserve calculation is designed for broker-dealers to protect customer funds. And that's cash that they've received from the customer as a deposit, if there are proceeds from the sale of customer securities, and that includes whenever a customer sells securities or shorts that it doesn't own with the intention to buy them back at a later date at a lower price, cash from customer dividends, or if there's a stock reorganization for the customer securities and it involves cash, it would also include those funds. The customer buys securities and there is a fail to receive, and the firm still has the cash and therefore doesn't move it, or if the firm is market-making activities and the firm doesn't have the securities on hand. If the customer securities are used as collateral for bank and stock loans and the firm receives cash, then you're going to include it to the reserve calculation. And finally, if there are cash and securities in suspense accounts, then based on the particular type of suspense account or suspense item it is and its aging, then you're going to include that in the reserve calculation also. In the first presentation, we demonstrated how to perform a manual reserve calculation. We also explained which security transactions should be included in the reserve calc. In this presentation, we're going to show how an allocation program can be used to estimate which security transactions are customer-related for inclusion in the reserve calculation. We're going to step through the process of creating that allocation program. And finally, we're going to explain how the allocation program itself can approximate a manually performed reserve calculation. Before we get started, a few disclaimers and notes. This presentation is for educational purposes only. It's not legal advice. If you're calculating an actual reserve calc, I'm going to refer you to the FINRA.org website and to their page for interpretations for financial and operational rules. I think the best way to make use of this presentation is to review it versus your firm's calculation and to compare the various items. A brief review of the categories for the reserve calculation. On the credit side, you have items 1 through 5, and they are related to customers' funds, either the funds that they've given to you or the funds they've received by using customer securities as collateral for, say, stock loan or for bank loans. 6, 7, 8, and 9, they are penalties or charges for efficiency for aged items, and there are some time frames that are related to each one of those particular items. Now, for this presentation, we're going to be manually doing a reserve calculation. So to make it a little bit easier to work with it, what we're going to do is only use the first 4 categories. On the debit side for the reserve formula, there is 10, which is debits in margin and cash accounts. That's money that we have lent to the customers to buy securities. For 11 and 12, that's securities borrowed and fails to deliver. And finally, 13 and 14 is cash received from customers and placed on deposit with either Options Clearing Corp or at other clearing agencies. For this presentation, we're only going to be using items 10, 11, and 12. This is where we left off in part 1. We have a trial balance and the customer transactions for the reserve calc. Together, they represent all the cash that we've received from the customers and from the use of their property. On the far right is a manually performed reserve calculation based on the trial balance and the transaction list. You can see the payable of $54,250 is reflected on the trial balance here. For the stock loan amount, same situation. The interesting balance is the fail to receive on the trial balance. You can see it's $10,080, and on the reserve calc, it's $8,750. The difference is the non-customer amount of $1,330. As you're well aware, it's only customer amounts that we're going to protect using the reserve calculation. Notice we have the credits less the debits of $21,000, and we've added a charge based on 3% of the debits. Normally, you would reduce the debits by 3% and then subtract that amount from the total credits to get the deposit requirement. We've done it this way to make it easier to follow the demonstration. This is a deeper dive into the Reserve Calc. Let's start with the customer credits. You can see there's $54,250 is credited to customers. It's composed of 3 items, and it's the deposit that customer A gave us. The short sale proceeds, remember customer A shorted 700 shares. Customer B's credit for sale, and as you recall for customer B, 500 shares, and customer B has not delivered that amount yet, those shares to the firm. There is a stock loan for $14,000, and that is related to the customer margin debits customer D. And if you recall, customer D had purchased 800 shares, put down 50%, and then loaned out 400 shares for a stock loan. And you can see here with these red arrows, this amount matches. Stock borrow, customer A had to make a delivery for a short sale, and you have to borrow the shares. So those amounts will match off. And then finally here is the failed to deliver, $17,500, and there it is again. If you recall, when we went ahead and subtracted off the debits from the credits, there was $21,000. The 3% we just simply put in as an added cushion. The reason why we did it that way is to demonstrate $21,000 is composed of customer A's deposit and also the failed to receive, particular instance, the $87.50. And that is over here, this customer sees, this is the transaction that came from. From this breakout, you can see that the short sale proceeds are offset by the stock borrow because that particular cash was given to another broker-dealer as collateral for the shares. So we're not protecting that in the reserve calculation. Customer margin debit, that is related to the stock loan because we received cash in from the shares. And of course, the failed to deliver securities, that's offset by the customer who has not delivered the securities, leaving customer A's original deposit for us to protect, as well as the $87.50 from customer C, who we do not have the shares for yet. As you can see, while most of the numbers will come from the trial balance, there are still items that require you to take a look at the transactions and whether they're customer related or non-customer related. In our example, it was the fail to receive that started off at $10,080, and we had to subtract the non-customer fail to receive. You can go through the transactions like we demonstrated, or what you can do is develop an automated allocation program. And that's going to have 3 attributes. First one is that if you're going to do this, then the result should be consistently applied. And you're going to use it each time you perform a reserve calc. On rare occasions, when you're deviating from the allocation, you should document the why. Now, if you're using an automated allocation program, it should be conservative to accomplish the maximum protection to customers. Now, that doesn't mean that the program deposits the maximum amount of money, just that the customers are fully protected. Finally, you have to demonstrate that the reserve calculation would be comparable as if you had manually performed the calculation by hand. When building an allocation model, you want to start with the stock record. Then you want to go line by line and categorize by type or bucket each owner or location. You want to pair off the left and the right bucket, and you're going to sequence the list to make an allocation model. And for each security, you want to sum the number of shares per bucket, and then going down the allocation list you prepared in steps 1 and 2, you want to pair off each bucket until no shares are left. To determine the value of that allocation, you want to use the market value of the security or the contract values for the fail to deliver and fail to receive contracts and the stock borrow and stock loan contracts. For our example, we've categorized as buckets both the long and the short side. You can see 1 through 14, we've got 5 long items and we've got 9 short items. Together, when we pair these off, we're going to end up with 45 different line items for our allocations. A couple of things to note: if a customer is long shares, it's going to be customer long. If they're short shares, it's going to be customer short. Same thing with firm long, firm short, and also non-customer long and non-customer short. On the next slide, we're going to show you what the allocations look like. And it's really pretty simple. You can see what we've done is just paired off the 5 long positions with every position that we had on the short side. In this particular instance, for the customer longs, there is 1 through 9. There's 9 allocations. You can see it's just customer long versus all the short positions. Next one down, firm long. And again, we've just paired off all the firm longs with the various different short positions. And that goes on all the way through stock borrow, through the fail to deliver and the non-customer long. And you can see now we have 45 different allocations. On this slide, you can see we've resequenced the allocations. Let's see how this was done. If you recall on the last slide, each long category was paired, with each short category creating a green-white, green-white, green pattern. We've reshuffled the sequence to try to replicate the firm's business model. This is a reiterative process and takes time to build out. The rules allow us to pair off the first 3 items, stock borrow versus stock loan, stock borrow versus fail to receive, and fail to deliver versus fail to receive. By doing so, it will reduce both the credit and debit side of the reserve calc for these amounts. Now, the benefit to the firm is that the reserve deposit requirement will be reduced by 3%. On the flip side, the firm will take a 1% charge to its net capital. The next slide will put some numbers around these allocations to demonstrate the impact. We've added the numbers to the allocations. Let's take a look at the first one, stock borrow versus stock loan. You can see we have paired off 400 long shares versus 400 short shares. These amounts always have to equal whenever you're doing an allocation. We multiplied it by $35 a share. That was actually the amount that each of the contracts were written for. So now each of them are worth $14,000. We come over here to the legend. We can see that yellow is equal removed from the reserve calc. Therefore, we're going to remove $14,000 from both the debits and the credits. Same situation here with the fail to deliver versus the fail to receive. And also, well, there's nothing here but the stock borrow and the fail to receives. Notice that we did not have any transactions that were actually stock borrow versus stock loan or fail to deliver versus fail to receive. However, the rule allows us to pair these amounts off. And that becomes a benefit for us because anything on the debit side, you have to reduce 3%. And therefore, by removing these from the reserve calculations before you have to remove the 3%, you're able to reduce your deposit. We go down through each one of the allocations and we're looking for our amounts that we can pair off. Say, for example, here's the firm long versus the firm bank loan. We saw that, and that was the 200 shares or $7,000. Doesn't impact us. We come over here, blue is not used for the reserve calc. Stock borrow versus customer short, 300 shares. You can see a stock borrow that is related to a customer would be included, and therefore the $10,500 is not going to have an impact on us. The way we have built our reserve allocation with the takeaway or the reduction method, what we're going to do is anything in the yellow, we're going to reduce from the reserve calc, either credit or debit, or in some instances, both. Now notice that for the first ones, 1, 2, and 3, there's a net capital charge. And if you come down here, you can see that the rule allows for stock borrow versus stock loan, stock borrow versus fail to receive, and fail to deliver versus fail to receive to be subtracted from both sides of the reserve calculation, but there is a net capital charge of 1%. In the next slide, we're going to show you 3 different ways that we have approached this and show you what the impacts would be if we did a reserve calculation using different methodologies. This slide shows 3 different models that we could use. The first one is what we saw on the last slide, and one thing I want to point out, The allocation process is this. You start off with the left bucket and compare it to the right bucket. You look for, do you have any shares in the left bucket? If you have shares in the left bucket, then you look to see if you have any shares in the right bucket. If you do, you take the smaller of the two, and that will become the total amount paired off. And then you go back to the bucket and subtract that amount off from each side. You keep doing that until you have completely allocated all of the buckets. Let's go ahead and look at the other two models to the right. First one is customer accounts are allocated first. As you recall, up here in the legend, you can see the green items are kept in the reserve. And this one kind of replicates what we expected or what we saw from the original transactions. And you can see here customer long versus stock loan. Truly, we only had 400 shares, and that's what it went for. This one's kind of interesting, customer long versus fail to receive. There is 288, and we only had 250 customer long versus fail to receives. The other 38 came from the non-customer long versus fail to receives. And that's going to be kind of interesting when we go a little bit further down. Stock borrow versus customer short. All 700 shares were shorted, and they borrowed that amount to make the delivery. Failed to deliver versus customer short. This was the customer who sold 500 shares and did not deliver them on settlement date. Now we come down to number 11. You can see non-customer long versus firm bank loan. And there's the 38 shares. And that's just simply the way this thing is sequenced. Again, the 38 shares, normally we would have expected to be non-customer long versus fail to receive, but because there were more customer longs and it's higher up in the allocation process, the 38 shares finally shows up here under 11, and it gives you this kind of anomaly. Same situation for number 43, you get customer long versus firm bank loan, 162 shares. Again, that's not what we saw before. And finally, the ones, say, firm long versus box. That's the 200 shares that's actually on the bank loan. And you can kind of see by changing the order of the allocations, you can get different results. On the last one, you have customer accounts allocated last. Here, all the items in yellow are removed from the Reserve Calc first. Stock borrow versus stock loan. We've seen that. Stock borrow versus fail to receive. Again, that's what the first one we did. Stock borrow versus the box, and also failed to deliver versus the box for 438 shares. Now, there's a little bit more to it than just failed to deliver versus the box, but for this particular example, we're just going to leave it. Again, doesn't really approximate what our situation is. So when we go to the next slide, we're going to see what the full calculation would look like if we use these different allocation sequences. This slide compares 4 reserve calculations, the original manual allocation, and 3 using automated allocation programs. When comparing the calculations, remember 2 things. 1. Allocation programs should be conservative to accomplish maximum protection for customers, and they must achieve comparable results to a reserve calculation that did not use an automated allocation system. Let's look at the difference in deposit amounts versus the manually performed reserve calculation. All of the examples meet the first requirement of accomplishing maximum protection of customers, as all have a higher deposit requirement than the manual. Therefore, the first requirement is met by all of the calculations. For the second requirement, the customer accounts allocated first, which is example number 3, has allocations that increase the credit side of the formula by allocating customer and non-customer shares to the firm bank loan. As we know from the transaction list, this did not happen. The reserve calculation with the customer accounts allocated last, example number 4, has both stock borrow and failed to deliver shares allocated to the box. Again, from the transaction list, we know that there were no stock borrows or failed to deliver shares in the box. Both of these automated allocations create conservative reserve calculations. However, they fail the comparable results test. The automated allocation approximates transactions, or example number 2, comes closest to approximating the manual reserve calculation. It can't completely replicate it because of the pair-off allocations of stock borrow versus stock loan and fail to deliver versus fail to receive, which are not transactions the firm originally engaged in. Based on the above, using the allocation approximates transaction sequence, or example number 2, it fulfills both of the requirements. Before using the sequence, the firm should backtest the program to verify the outcome in various scenarios. A few thoughts. Prepare by organizing all of the allocation information into a single document. It's spread throughout the rule, so make it easy by using Excel to list all of the required allocations. Though not required, allocate all the buckets. It will help you determine if the process is working correctly. And finally, track the most common stock record errors and include them as buckets. No system is error-free, and it will help when allocating all of the stock record. Everything we've discussed today can be found on the FINRA.org website. If you're interested in the background of the reserve calculation rules, check out these 2 SEC releases, which can be found in the Federal Register. In addition, the Customer Protection Rule by Mike Jamroz gives additional insight into the rule and what the SEC is trying to accomplish with the reserve calculation. Thanks for watching this week, and if you have any questions, send me an email at bob@rmilburnconsulting.com.